Greetings, and welcome to The Recovering Theist. This is the first episode in a series that will explore the Bible, verse by verse, and deconstruct it. We will use a modern scientific worldview to either refute or verify biblical claims. I spent 15 years as a member of a conservative, born-again denomination. I preached, taught Sunday school, traveled on mission trips, went to conferences, camps, retreats, and everything in between. Suffice to say, I've done it all. In this series, I want to take you on a journey similar to but not identical to my own, one where we read the Bible and let it stand on its own. I think we all can agree that the supposed Word of God should be able to stand on its own without any help from anyone. With that, I invite you to join me on a journey like the one that changed my life twice. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, read closely, one can see that the text of Genesis was written by someone that seems to lack a basic understanding of the processes that govern the universe. And it's twofold. The first four words of the first chapter of the first book that we regard as the Bible, the first 5 books of the Bible are called the Torah or the Pentateuch, basically the Law of Moses. But they're emblematic of the failure in the logic of creationism. Here it says, in the beginning, which from the perspective of a Bronze Age storyteller means the beginning of all things. Yet, when the story was first told, and or written down, because it was passed from generation to generation, most likely before it was ever written down, the writer failed to see that the statement is really a nonsensical one. It adds complexity and baggage to a story that doesn't need one. From their perspective, the writer's perspective, it adds authority and power to the claim. A claim that now mustn't be questioned, not because of God's existence is the one being questioned, but because to do so would question the Almighty himself. However, through a lens informed by an understanding of modern science, this only raises more questions. The most obvious and often asked question of these is, what was before God? To a critical person, this seems to be an obvious question that obviously demands an answer. To a believer, however, and I used to be in this camp, this is merely a footnote in the context of a larger story. Common responses to this question are, God exists outside of normal space and time, so therefore the laws of nature do not apply to him. Or, God is just giving us a basic outline so that we can understand it. And some go so far as to use what I like to call the Obi-Wan defense. I'm sure somebody else has called it this before, but I've never heard it, which is where they say something like, this is written down from the perspective of a person that lived thousands of years ago, and so it is true from their point of view. This list of responses is by no means exhaustive, but you get the point. All the responses are meant to either throw you off the scent of rot prevailing these stories by deflecting it to the majesty of the unknown, or in the case of the Obi-Wan defense, make the meaning relative enough that you concede the point just to get away from it, to move on. Either way, these are nothing but delay tactics, attempting to get you onto a subject that they can more easily defend, because there's no real defense. Here they will be happy to turn what is meant to be an objective statement into a subjective one. This is a defense that is employed often in defending the Bible. It's the only way to make it work in the modern age. It is here, in the first 4 words of the Bible, that we see one of the glaring holes left by its authors. The concept of an existence not based entirely around the earth is not even considered. The sun, the moon, the stars, everything is viewed as being centered on the earth. Now, the remaining 6 words of this verse are equally as problematic as the first 4. Here it skips through the entire history of the universe in just a few words. We know that the age of the universe is about 13.7 billion years or so. In this verse, the heavens are the universe and the earth is, of course, the earth. And we know from a variety of independent measurements that the earth is about 4.5 billion years old. So it takes the Bible 6 words to traverse 9.2 billion years from the creation of the universe to the birth of the earth. That's about 1.5 billion years per word. It also denotes a lack of understanding in the way that our solar system even formed. The sun isn't mentioned in any specific way for 15 more verses, but in the real world, we know that the sun is about 100 million years older than the earth, possibly more than that. And we know that the earth couldn't have even formed without the influence of the sun, not in any kind of way that we would recognize it today. Yet it seems to be an afterthought in this story. For now, I'll just leave this right here, but we will cover this in more detail in a future video. Okay, now on to Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, where it says, "The earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters." Okay, here we see the narrative from verse 1 continued. The earth seems to be either stationary in space or coasting through space alone. No Venus or Mars or Jupiter, Sun, solar system, even the Milky Way itself seems to be non-existent. The earth is completely dark and somehow both formless and yet having a surface of the deep and a surface of the waters. To me, it seems to imply that the earth was essentially a water world. Yet, this immediately presents a problem. The earth described in this scenario would not have the heat necessary to maintain a liquid ocean. The water world would be a ball of solid ice, similar to Saturn's moon Enceladus, except for that there would be no celestial body pumping energy into the Earth's system the way Saturn does, with its immense gravitational forces that act on Enceladus and help maintain the subsurface. Earth would not have that. So except near geothermal vents at the bottom of our oceans, there would be no liquid water on the planet. It would essentially be a giant snowball in space. Except that Genesis also says that the world was formless and void. A water world or a snowball earth would still have form. So that's not really possible either. While it certainly is possible that a primordial earth could, given enough time and luck, accumulate the gravitational mass to reach the size it is today, however unlikely that may be, there is no mention of other celestial bodies. Even the moon is left out in these early verses, and that presents an even larger problem. Scientific consensus is that the moon was formed as the result of a collision between the Earth and a Mars-sized object. So yet another key part of our planet's history is just missing from this account. Not only is a sufficient explanation for the moon's formation not present, but according to Genesis, thus far, it's not even possible. There's no mention or even hint of other planets or their components thereof being formed. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's examine what is mentioned in this verse and push forward from there. This verse leaves us with two major questions that we need to address before we can move on. Question number 1. Water exists? Where did the water come from? We know that the Big Bang created mostly hydrogen and helium with a little lithium and maybe some beryllium, but really nothing else. A water molecule is 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen. Oxygen is created in the hearts of stars that, according to Genesis, haven't been created yet. So where did the oxygen come from? No oxygen, no water, and certainly no liquid water. Additionally, even if you somehow had a supply of oxygen on the Earth, it would be so cold that elemental oxygen would fall on the surface like snow. Second question, what does the surface of the deep consist of? Genesis seems to imply that the Earth is made of a substance or substances other than rock. We know this to be completely inaccurate, but nonetheless, here it is. As was the case with water, this is a dead giveaway that the author doesn't know what the earth is made of. In verse 1, he created the earth, but here he seems to deconstruct it somewhat. Little does the author know that, for our purposes, the earth is made of the same materials throughout, rock and metal and all of that else in between. It is merely temperature and convection currents that change the distribution of its materials. This also ties into the water issue. The earth is made up of elements that are formed in the heart of stars, most of which are heavier than oxygen. The most important of which, for the earth at least, and what we're talking about, is uranium and other radioactive elements. These elements are only formed when the largest of stars reach their supernova phase and in an instant fuse elements heavier than lead. These elements drive our planet's core through radioactive decay, giving off heat, keeping it molten, and thereby driving our magnetic fields and keeping them active. Without these driving the life cycle of our planet's interior, the Earth would look like Mars does today. Verse 2 highlights a common theme that we will encounter throughout the Bible and other texts. Christopher Hitchens said many times that religion is man's first attempt to explain the universe, and this is an example of that. The author is trying to give, for the time, a logical origin to the earth. Viewed in that context, this explanation makes as much sense as any. Water and fire were considered elements. Now, this part is just, my guess. I really don't know what he could have been thinking, but it makes perfect sense from their view, perhaps, that the water would come first as it quenches flame. Perhaps from their perspective, if the flame were to come first, it would consume the world or something to that effect. But with the water being there before the flame, it could be contained. Either way, this verse throws a universe-sized wrench into the biblical creation account. This claims to be the account of creation as told by God and written down by Moses. A cursory examination of the first two verses shows this to be false. It does, however, show the beginnings of humanity grasping to know more and understand the universe around them. Next time, we will continue with our verse-by-verse examination of Genesis. Until then, I'm the recovering theist, and I invite you to keep looking up.